My name is Vivian McCullogh, and my book is Pawnee Prisoner, the story of Jane Gocher Crawford. It is a story of survival that's based on a true story about a family that lived along a road called the Gocher Trace in central Texas. And I'm going to be reading from chapter 3, and at this point, it's 1837, and Jane is a widow. Her husband died at the Alamo, and she has a daughter, and they've moved back in with her parents, Jim and Nancy Gocher, and her 5 brothers. It had been a year after the fall of the Alamo, and the Gocher family hoped for a brighter year with good fortune and happier times. The battle at Gonzales, the siege at Bears, and the loss at the Alamo had affected them just as it had many of their friends and neighbors. The looting and suffering caused by General Santa Anna's army had sent settlers fleeing for their lives, burying their valuables, and later coming home to find burnt homes and scattered debris. Jim hadn't left during what was called the Runaway Scrape, but many had. Santa Anna had finally been defeated at San Jacinto. Bastrop was being rebuilt, and healing for those along the Colorado River who had lost their fathers and husbands in one battle or another had begun for everyone except Jane. She still longed for Lemuel. They had only been married 2 years when he was killed at the Alamo. There is no way she could have prevented Lemuel Crawford from following his heart and joining the fight. He said he was doing this for them. He said he'd be back. She didn't fault him. In fact, she was proud of his stance against the Mexican government, but she needed him far more than she realized. Christmas had been a bright spot for the Gocher family as 2-year-old Margaret Elizabeth, or Maggie as everyone called her, was at just the right age to take it all in with wide eyes and excitement. Her strawberry red hair, her turned up nose, and her bright blue eyes were the first things you noticed when she came into the room. But her laugh never failed to warm your heart. She was smarter than normal, according to her grandparents. Jane believed it too, of course. Maggie loved sitting in Grandma Nancy's lap, hearing about the baby Jesus. Papa Jim would sing to her in his big, booming voice, and the family laughed until their sides ached as she would dance around, singing the only 2 words she could remember. It was bittersweet for Jane to watch. Lemuel should be there, seeing his only child growing up. As much as Jane loved Christmas, singing carols, and hiding handmade gifts in little-known spaces, she still missed the first man she ever kissed and the first man to make her feel like Texas was home. Samuel, Jane's oldest brother, came home from his second 3-month tour of duty as a ranger, tired and ready to enjoy being with family again. Nathaniel was Jane's slightly younger brother and the namesake of his maternal grandfather. He had taken on a lot of chores around the work camp and homestead after Lemuel was killed and Samuel went off with the Rangers. It had been a struggle. When Paul wanted something done, it was done one way or another, and Nate had the sore muscles to prove it. With Samuel being home again, it was like a sack of lead lifted from his shoulders, literally. It was now early March, and the weather was a bit warmer. They had learned that the weather in Texas was unpredictable, though. In the 4 years they had lived here, 1 March had been rainy, 1 quite warm, and 1 started off with freezing rain that lasted at least a week and kept everyone inside huddling near the fire. They were at the work camp on Rabs Creek, where they spent a good deal of their time. The 1,280-acre headright had been claimed by 18-year-old Nate about a year after they arrived in Texas in 1833. That March morning, Jim was surprised by the sudden appearance of a storm brewing on the horizon. Fearing the spring rainy season was beginning earlier than it had the year before, he quickly called for Samuel and Nate to hurry with him to the woods to bring in more firewood. Nate hitched the horses to the wagon, while Samuel and Jim grabbed a saw and a couple of axes from the barn. With the clouds rolling in and thunder in the distance, Nancy also began preparing for the approaching storm. "James Lawrence," Nancy called, "it's not the time for crawdad fishing. Get back to the house. I need you to bring in more water before it starts raining. Is John Henry with you?" She stretched to see the banks of Rab's Creek where the boys played as often as they could. "Be there in a minute," came the whiny reply. "You heard me, James. And Will, play with Maggie, please, so I can bring in the washing." She had just finished the clothes, and now they were going to have to dry inside by the fire. 6-year-old Will was always a handful of energy. She was surprised he hadn't followed his brothers to the creek. Instead, he was digging in a dirt pile by one of the large oak trees that provided a nice shade in the hot Texas summers. He was making a fort, like the one Samuel had told him about over by the Colorado River. He was going to call his Fort Will. Maggie took off running to Will as fast as her little legs would go. It seems that 2 years old is the running age. Maybe because the freedom of going where you want is now in your ability, you get there as fast as you can. She stumbled just as she reached the dirt floor, smashing face first into Fort Will and getting a mouthful of dirt in the process. "Maggie, Ma, she's ruined my fort. I don't want her out here." Will kicked at the dirt, leaned against the tree, his arms folded and his bottom lip sticking out. "The rain is going to mess up your fort anyway. Just do as I say." Jane was inside, mending the boys' trousers. It was a non-stop task with 3 young boys in the house. Jim and Nancy appreciated all the help she provided after moving back with them. It had been a hard year for Jane after losing Lemuel at the Alamo. She was quieter than usual and had refused to go back and live in the cabin she had shared with him before his death. Jane stopped as she heard a low rumble. Thunder, she thought, hoping the storm would go through without a lot of wind. There can sure be some big windstorms in spring and fall that would send rocking chairs tumbling, empty barrels to rolling around, and even remove some of the wood planks on the barn and house. Outside, from the corner of her eye, Nancy saw a movement among the trees to the left of the creek, near the empty cabin that had belonged to Jane and Lemuel. "James, are you boys coming? You better not be hiding from me," she said. Pausing and looking again, she whispered, "Probably just a bird." Still, she felt uneasy. "James, now," she insisted. "We're coming," came the faint reply, barely heard over the thunder. Nancy couldn't help but feel nervous. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was the approaching storm that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on its end. Whatever it was, she was anxious for James and John Henry to get back to the house. "Will, bring Maggie to the house." Nancy glanced at the sky, surveyed the surrounding fields and trees one more time. Something's just not right. A dozen Pawnee Indians lay waiting among the trees on the opposite side of the Gotcha Trace from the family's work camp. Almost that many more were catching up to the raiding party after moving stolen cattle taken in raids along the Rio Grande to a trading post near Bear. The raiding party had stopped at this farm 3 months earlier to steal from the family on their way south, but had turned away because of visitors that came riding up to chat to the 2 men with rifles walking from an outbuilding at the back of the property. They were now on their way to their village for the spring planting season. Winter was the time for hunting. Most of the Pawnee in their village were involved in hunting buffalo. There was some of the tribe, however, who liked raiding Indian ranches that often had large herds of cattle and horses. The Pawnee Raiders were led by Standing Bear, the fiercest of the Pawnee warriors. He was often looked upon poorly by chiefs in the village for his brutality, though he was rarely punished for his ways. The tribe preferred to be friendly with white settlers, but there was always a few who wanted war. The raiding party was ready for battle on this cloudy day. Their faces were painted, with black circling their eyes and across the bridge of their nose, much like the face of a raccoon. Red paint streaked across their foreheads and cheeks. Some wore it on their arms. Their heads were shaven on the sides, with the remaining hair heavily greased with buffalo fat to make it stand up on the end. Eagle and hawk feathers were entwined in the hair, and they wore rawhide bands around their necks. They were bare-chested even on this cool March morning, and wore buckskin leggings and cloth tied on at the waist. They carried bows and arrows, spears, knives, and 3 carried guns taken in raids. Thirsty to get hostages and return home, they spent more than an hour watching the Gotcher work camp and waiting for an opportunity to take what they wanted. The pending storm would cover the sound of the horses and mask the rustle of leaves. No one would chase them in a storm, and their tracks would wash away. Now was the time to attack. Standing Bear nodded, and the attack began. You can find out about the fate of each of the family members that day, the brave and courageous battle they gave. And you can find out about Jane's sacrifice she made that day, and her determination, her courage, and her will to protect those that were taken captive with her, and her desire to bring them back all safely to the Gotcher Trace. Thank you. My book's available in paperback and ebook on Amazon, Blockbuster, and most online retailers. Thank you.